Recording in
statement.
progress.
Is there anything on page 2? I'll flick over the pages. Page 3 again covers that. No, nothing at all. And then we go on to item 4, which was the draft statements of accounts. I can't see anybody doing it. Page 4, page 5, page 6, page 7. I think that if I can't see anybody's hands up, I can only see 4 hands up, 4 people on the bottom row. So perhaps if anybody has got their hand up, they can perhaps speak out, and I could let them in. I'm sorry. So I take it that we accept the minutes of the previous meeting, and then I think we then move on to item 3, which is the corporate health and safety annual report. I think that this is, it's quite an interesting report, and I think that we welcome Mr. Stephen Nichol, who is the principal corporate health and safety advisor. So welcome, Stephen.
Thank you. As I say, it's the report. I think it's been presented a few times now as sort of an annual report on the corporate health and safety performance, and it is literally just for consideration by the audit committee. I don't want to go through it in depth because obviously you've had the chance to see it. What the main point I would say is the past year's predominantly been dominated by COVID and reaction to COVID and dealing with that, to be honest.
And that has placed much more difficulties on your position with those restrictions on, with in fact meeting and speaking to people and taking these to investigate them.
Yes, it's been very difficult. The increase in work on the corporate health and safety team and the risk and insurance manager has come from because of the review of all the risk assessments with the opening up and locking down. Before anything could be done, we had to go through each risk assessment. So that's been a lot of work this year, is going through that. We have managed to do a few inspections, care homes and schools, some accompanied by environmental health and some accompanied by the health and safety executive. Touch wood, we haven't had any significant issues to deal with as yet. Internally, that is, obviously.
Well done. Can I ask the committee, is there any questions to ask? Stephen? Yes, I've got one. I've got Dilwyn.
I just want to ask about the take-up of training. On page 20 and 21, there are some listings of attendance at training sessions. And I was wondering, on the table 12, that I think that totals just over 220 people attending. What's that as a sort of percentage of the total who could have attended but didn't?
I'm sorry, I couldn't give you the exact figure as a percentage of everything of the people that could have. But what we've done over the past year, my interpretation of it is where the refresher training has been required as a necessity, we've done that rather than sort of getting people in en masse, obviously because of the restrictions of COVID. And a lot of the work that HR have done, in fairness to them, is they've moved a lot of training onto the online e-learning type packages. So, as I say, it's only recently that we've actually managed. Well, we're having to look at face-to-face training because we're allowed to do it now. But also because of some of the sort of training is expiring, so it's a necessity. An example I could give you is first aid training has to be done every 3 years. So we're trying to manage that basically at the minute.
During 2021, was it possible to have face-to-face training, or did that happen for a few months?
There was maybe about a month where we could have done, but it was a case of it was more online. It is only literally now, or sort of within the past few months, as I say, that we've been looking more closely at the face-to-face training.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
I wonder if another question that perhaps could be asked, and I think what Dilwyn was getting to was the number of people who take the training. Perhaps if we reverted back, is that on much the numbers that we've got here in previous years prior to the COVID? The training numbers would be greater than they are now, because obviously with the COVID that has affected so many people not being able to be available anyhow.
That's a figure I would have to confirm with the department. Sorry.
Yeah, don't worry. Is there anybody else would like to ask anything else on health and safety?
Chair Dylan Rees, could I ask a question, please?
Yeah, of course you can. I'm sorry, Dylan, I couldn't see that.
Thank you. Obviously, the impact of COVID has meant that people are having to work from home, and we've had Zoom meetings instead of face-to-face meetings, which means that the staff will have been in front of computer screens far much more than they used to be. And obviously there are concerns of the long-term damage to health by sitting in front of a computer screen for too long. Is this something that's being considered more closely now in terms of the action plan for health and safety?
Yes, it was sort of almost from the instigation of working from home. It was something that we were looking at. There is an online training package available for staff to look at doing their own DSE assessments to raise awareness of the DSE issues. It enables them to sort of assess whether the workstation at home is suitable and whether they are doing what's need to be. And all staff that work on the computers, it's mandatory for them to do it. So it was something that we were working on, ironically, pre-COVID, but it's something that escalated due to COVID. And it's always been, throughout, from the very start of this, it's been one of the main concerns, obviously, because it's quite a significant risk. I am aware of staff having additional equipment given to them to enable them to work from home, and the need for the staff to do their own individual risk assessments to identify if there's extra equipment that's needed. It's going to be an ongoing piece of work as well, I would imagine.
Thank you.
I have one. I think I've got one more hand up, and that's John Griffiths. Anybody else aware? I've got
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Back in 2018, the County Council were told by the HESC regarding the Hound. It took 2 years to conform with that notice to improve by the HESC. Can you explain what the reason for that was and why it took so long to respond to that, and what the situation is currently to it? It's under item 5, sorry. Yes,
that was done in 2018. The HESC executive came in, did an inspection on us, gave us the improvement notice, and you are given, I think it's sort of 6 months to comply with the notice. So we did that. We presented them with the information. The sort of delay period was due to their investigation into it. We basically, they'd asked for information, we provided them information. There was a couple of meetings that we had with them where they actually came down. So obviously, you have to allow time for them to actually come in and make the appointments for them to come in. Once we had the meetings with them and we'd satisfied them with giving them all the information that we could, they then went away to deliberate as to what the actions would be. And it was a case of they felt that we'd complied with the improvement notice. We did have a sort of a closing meeting with the health and safety executive, and when Morgan was present in the meeting, where the two inspectors went through everything. One of the sort of the things that came up in the meeting was that they had actually prosecuted Wrexham for a similar sort of incident, but it was a case of the work that we'd done satisfied them, and it was a case of, obviously, with health and safety, it's one of the things where we have to keep on top of it. The current controls that we have in place match with the requirements of what the health and safety executive have asked us to do, and we have had since the meeting with the HSE, the closing meeting with the HSE, I think myself, Anwen as the chief exec, housing and my line manager, we've had about 3 or 4 meetings afterwards just to continue the actual monitoring of the situation. But the corporate health and safety team are constantly monitoring it. We have a health and safety officer in housing who's constantly monitoring it, and then we have these sort of periodic meetings with the chief exec to feedback on what the current situation is. So we are keeping an eye on that situation.
Thank you, diolch yn fawr. Without going into detail, personal detail, of course, can you just explain, what the incident was about?
It's hand-on vibration, it is. So it's sort of, if you use power tools, electric drills, things like that, what you can do, due to exposure to vibration over a period of time, you can get sort of damage to the nerve endings. The issue with this sort of thing is that you can improve your occupational health monitoring, which then will identify potential problems. So by improving the work that you're doing, you're possibly identifying historic issues, which then come to light because of the work that you've been doing has now identified it. And that, I would say, was potentially the issue with that individual. And it was a case of, historically, they'd been exposed to high vibration levels. The work that we've done sort of leading up to the notice and since the notice has been to reduce the exposure levels to a really significantly low level. It's more than compliant with the action levels that the HSE recommend.
Diolch yn fawr am yr eglurad. Thank you.
Thank you for the explanation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that brings that to an end. Thank you very much indeed, Stephen, for coming here to give us that information. And now I ask, the recommendation is that this committee considers the report and the recommendations included. Could I have a proposer and a seconder for that, please? Yeah, I've got John Griffiths who's going to propose it. Sorry, I can't see anybody else. Oh, yeah, Gwilym. Thank you very much indeed. Yeah, Gwilym and John Griffiths. So I now need to go around the committee. Dylan Rees.
Derbyn, accept.
Alan Roberts.
Derbyn.
Accept.
Margaret Roberts.
Accept.
Jeff Evans.
Accept.
And Dilwyn.
Accept.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that. So with that, then we'll move then on to item 4, which is the annual Treasury management review for 2021, and I think is Mark is going to lead obviously on this.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, this is the usual report which comes to the Audit Committee, which summarises the situation on Treasury management during the year. It's a requirement by the Code for us to bring this report before you as an Audit Committee who is responsible for looking at Treasury management. It's one of 3 reports which comes. We give you a mid-year review, and also the strategy comes before it is adopted by the council soon in the year as well. So I'll just go through the report quickly, just to pick out the main points. Paragraph 2 mentions the external factors. The interest rates, of course, that's important in the treasury management process, and the interest rates have fallen during the year, and it's down now to 0.10%, which affects how much money we can produce through investments. It also has an effect on the cost of borrowing, but it's not as much of a change on that as it is on what we can create through investment. And there's a paragraph 2.2 then, which gives a little bit more information about what's happened in the economy, which has been affected more or less during the year with the effect of COVID and the Brexit effect. Paragraph 3 then, the first table in paragraph 3 shows our capital expenditure, and there's a further table which provides more information on the underspend. Of course, this report, or the capital monitoring report, has gone to the executive and has been accepted by the executive last month. Paragraph 3.2 then shows what our balances and reserves are, and this, of course, is part of what is audited at the moment, and there is a possibility these figures will change, but it does show that our reserves and provisions have increased by 31.1 million to 45.24 million. Table in paragraph 3.3.1 then shows the gross borrowing and the capital financing requirement. That is a different figure to that and shows how much more or how much is needed to borrow to fund the capital expenditure in full. So at the moment it's 136.6 million. We foresee it'll increase to 146.1 and then to 157.6, the capital financing requirement in the following year. Paragraph 3.2 in the table there shows that the council has used balances and cash sitting in our bank accounts to fund capital expenditure rather than borrowing. So as you'll see there, the balance of the borrowing is 124 million and the CFR is 136.6 million. So we've used 12.1 million of the council's money rather than it's sitting in bank accounts and having to borrow. It's reasonable for us to use our own cash in the first instance rather than going out to borrow, because how much we receive on our investments is so low and is a lot lower than it would cost in the interest of any loan. Paragraph 3.5, debt repayments. We've paid 3 debts back during the year. The biggest one was, to remind you, in March 2020, as the pandemic was beginning, I decided to borrow £10 million for a year in order to ensure that we had enough money to fund any costs that the council faced as a result of the pandemic. Glad to say that money wasn't needed and we didn't have any financial cash flow issues during the year. And that is partly down to additional money and the assistance given by Welsh Government in relation to paying money to us quickly and early and through the hardship fund for extra costs and loss of income. So the £10 million was repaid in March 2021. Investments, our interest rates are low and we're still carrying balances, significant balances, which are higher than usual in reserve. We are trying to invest the best we can in different areas in line with the policy and treasury management strategy, and we are using other councils as places where we invest our money. There is reference there to a loan to Stockport, Metropolitan Council and Salford, and those have been paid back. And we have one loan of 5 million, which is sitting with Flintshire Council at the moment as well. So paragraph 3.7 on the table there gives you an outline of the balance and the treasury position and the loans that we have, and also a little bit more information on the investments that we have at the moment. Paragraph 4 notes the Council's treasury management strategy. We haven't repaid loans early because it costs us too much. The cost of paying back loans early is bigger than we would save in interest, so we're just leaving those loans come to an end of their life naturally. We're not borrowing without needing. We're not borrowing to reinvest. That's against the policy and financially wouldn't be worth doing. As I say, the cost of the interest on the loan would be significantly higher than we'd receive if we invested that money. We're still continuing to invest, first of all, safely. We only invest in banks and so on who have credit ratings that are in line with what we have set out in the treasury management strategy. We ensure that we have quite quick access to that money so that we don't tie it up long term, so that we can get to our money, and then that creates, rather than creating a financial problem for us. And the third thing is trying to create money through interest rates, but that's very difficult because rates are so low and how much we get on loans. For example, our money in our bank accounts, we get 0.01% for that at the moment, which isn't really worth mentioning, to be honest. And as I said, because of that, we do use cash balances of the councils rather than borrowing, if that's possible. Then paragraph 5 then mentions the prudential indicators, as they're called, which manages what we can do and sets limits on how much we borrow and so on. And I can note that in paragraph 6, those are noted there, our performance, and each one is within the strategy. We haven't broken any of them. Our loan borrowing is lower than expected, and our investments are on a bit of a high level, but they're okay. The two in table 6.1, those two that show what the annual cost is of borrowing, it is staying consistent. It's lower than last year, as you can see. For the councils, it's 4.8%, and for the HRA, 16.34%, which is lower than the previous year. And then paragraph 7 just summarizes and looks forward. We don't see much change in interest rates, so our strategy won't change. We'll still repay when the loans come to the end of their life and need to be repaid, and we'll use the council cash before borrowing if that's possible, and we'll ensure that we try and invest in line with the strategy. But as I say, we won't get much interest on that money during the year. And just to note, there are no PWLB loans that are coming to the end of their life during this financial year. So to summarize, not much change. The strategy has continued, and I don't foresee any change in the strategy in the medium term, at least. Until interest rates start to increase, there's not much we can do to change our strategy. But we will take advice, obviously, from external financial consultants that we have that are helping us how we invest and when to borrow, and we receive their advice before we make any decision. So with that, that's it, a summary of the report, and happy to take any questions from any members. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. Do I? There's no hands up. Oh, just a minute. Sorry. John Griffiths first, and then I've got Gwilym, I think. Yeah. Sorry, John.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Diolch yn fawr. Just in the dialogue.
Just one or two questions, short questions if I can, Mark. Under 3.1, it refers there to the tourism in, I take it it's in Holyhead, a little bit over £1 million there, and also there's mention of something similar with the regeneration of Holyhead, 850,000. I've been hearing about these for a while. What's the situation in relation to them, and why aren't they being progressed? These were European projects. It's European grants that are paying for them, and there was a lot of toing and froing around the tourism gateway one to agree with WEFO, the part of Welsh government that are responsible for European money, for them to agree what was in the plan and what wasn't, and who was financing what. So there was a delay with those in the beginning, and then of course COVID slowed everything down. During 21-22, we didn't have much expenditure in the first 3-4 months of the year, so it has slowed down the expenditure. And those two plans WEFO have confirmed that the grant is still, that we still have the grant, we don't lose any money, but of course that was just a little bit late to completing both of those projects, but the council isn't losing money at all because of that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark. There is quite an investment in some other county councils. Is the WEFO arrangement, do we have to pay an administrative fee on that? And do we do credit checks on the other counties? Do we do credit rating checks, sorry? Usually there is a broker in the middle between us and another council that borrows from us, but it's the council that borrows the money that pays the broker's fee and not us. In a situation like Flintshire, for example, we have a contact and we work well with councils in Wales, and especially in North Wales. So the first arrangement with Flintshire had gone through a broker, but when we rolled the investment forward, we didn't use the broker the second time, so there weren't any costs involved. As regards credit checks, well, councils are seen as very, very low risk, usually, but the situation has probably changed a little bit with that. We do look at their accounts, and you can't, a council doesn't have a credit rating as a bank does, so we have to do that research work before investing. And we are aware through the press and so on which councils are in trouble. Northampton was the obvious one, but there are a few others around as well. We are aware of those, and our consultants let us know which ones they think aren't suitable for us to borrow to, but Flintshire wasn't on that list. Flintshire are totally safe in our opinion, so I was happy that investment sits with Flint at the moment. Thank you, Mark.
Gwilym?
In the report, and specifically under 3.2, you've noted a list of reserves there. And one that stands out, I think, is the schools. reserves, and we see in a year, we've seen an increase of about 4 million there. And in the past, I know that schools have been criticised by different individuals and different organisations for keeping too much money in reserve. And with the reserves having been inflated so much in some schools, especially secondary schools, what would your advice be to head teachers and governors? Try and keep some of that money for a rainy day, or try and find specific projects or plans, appropriate plans within the school to spend that money? Okay, well, yes, you're totally correct. The council was criticised that the balances of schools' reserves were high. And I think at one time Anglesey was the highest in Wales at one point. Over the last 2 years, the balances of school have reduced significantly as cuts have come in, and schools have been using their balances to balance their budgets every year. There are, I think, 3 main reasons why balances have increased significantly during this year. And just to note, the situation of Anglesey is no different to any other council. We all report similar stories about the significant increase in the school balances in reserve. I think Gwynedd Council has noted it's 10 million, I think. The first reason Welsh Government at the end of the financial year was giving additional grants to schools, knowing that schools can hold those balances in reserves. Welsh Government were trying to find ways of making sure they were distributing money to places they could be kept, and schools were one of those. They are grants to be used as ways of helping the school to put more resources in to help children catch up who have suffered because of schools being closed over the last year. So significant sums will be spent from those reserves during the year anyway. The second reason then, of course, as schools have been closed, the council in March 2020 gives the budgets to the schools. So once they do that, the money sits with a different body to the council. Now, we could have looked at this and said, well, we should try and recover those budgets that the schools received and take it back from the schools. But there was not much point or reason to do that. So as the schools were closed, of course, they spend less money, especially on things like supply teachers, energy, photocopiers, paper, the type of things they use from day to day as the school is open. So there were savings more or less for every school because they received a budget for running that school for a full year, but the school wasn't open for a full year. So with the secondary schools, of course, there's a significant sum in their budget for examination costs and the payments they pay WJC, but the sum that's been paid to WJC isn't close to what 100% of examination costs is if examinations had taken place as usual. So there is a saving for secondary schools there as well. And to answer your final question, of course, the advice I always try and give schools is, yes, the money in reserve can be used for projects, which is specific projects, which will benefit the school, but also schools will have to remember that it's very handy to have money in reserve to answer financial problems if the numbers of school children fall, especially if numbers fall for a year or two where the budget reduces and then it goes back up. Well, to bridge that gap, rather than making cuts in numbers of staff and then re-employing staff as the numbers then increase and the budget is available, they can use that reserve money to bridge that gap in pupil numbers. So it's always handy for them to keep an element of reserves. Of course, as money becomes tighter and budgets reduce, schools are supposed to be using the budget to balance their annual budget, but usually we try and see what their plans are and advise them, well, if they need to make cuts because that the long-term situation shows that the budget will reduce, well, they'd better make those reductions sooner rather than later, because the only thing it does is reduce the situation of that particular school. Delaying it for a year or two, you're just using your reserves. So one, that money's been spent, it's been spent, hasn't it? So that's the type of advice we give schools. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I got Dilwyn, I think.
Thank you, Chair. Mark, just really a question about forecasts of inflation and bank rate. I note that at the moment, the link estimate of bank rate going through to 2024, it's going to stay at 0.1%. Now, already this year, we're seeing huge inflationary pressures, which I don't think have yet been reflected in the index. So currently, inflation, CPI is running at 2.5%. RPI is running at 3.9%. And I don't understand how current levels of inflation, which are likely to increase, aren't reflected in an increasing bank rate, because the two can't survive when there's a big disparity. The second little point I'd like to just raise is that on table 3.1, where you say that there was no borrowing for HRA capital expenditure, I've got stuck on the maths, because 13 was spent actually on HRA capital, and the funding was by grants and resources coming to 12. Is it just a rounding error, or is it a mistake? And the other thing I'd like, I know interest rates are very low at the moment, and there could well be an argument that one could start borrowing now for what I would call the rainy day, when you will need more capital, if you can manage to accelerate your capital expenditure. But the way in which capital expenditure has gone in the past is that your estimates have been undershot by very large margins. In fact, this year it was almost 50% lower than planned, half. You wanted 39, you spent 20. And there could well be an argument that while interest rates are very low, one could consider borrowing on a fixed interest longer term loan before interest rates start rising. Thank you.
Right, so I'll start with the easy one. The second question, I think it's just a rounding error between, it's probably 12 point something, and when you round the two, round ones down, it's probably just a rounding error, I think. So that's simple to answer. On the first question, inflation versus bank rate, I think the Bank of England's assessment is that inflation, although it's spiked at the moment, will go back down, because what's driving it at the moment probably is an element of pent-up demand, and inflation, of course, compares this year's costs with what they were last year. So if you take something like petrol, petrol has risen significantly in the last few months compared to the middle of April, May, June of last year, when nobody was travelling anywhere and nobody was buying petrol, was it? So once that evens out, and you're comparing 2021 and 2022 to 2021, that should reduce interest rates and inflation rates. I think that's the Bank of England's assessment, that they'll live with this in the short term. on the assumption that inflation will drop. Also, you've got some element of pent-up demand now, haven't you? People will spend because they haven't had the opportunities to spend. But once that has fizzled out, what will happen to demand for things like holidays and those sorts of things, and that will have an impact on inflation. So I think the longer term view that the Bank of England are taking is that inflation will come back down to under 2, and there's no need to have a short term increase in inflation in interest rates to cover off that. The purpose of course of raising bank rates is if people are spending, driving inflation through consumer spending, well, because interest rates are so low and it's not worth them holding money in as savings, well, people will go out and spend. So you put up interest rates to make people think twice and put their money in the bank for a rainy day rather than spend. So if inflation, I think, carries on, well, I think Bank of England might review that 0.1%, but they don't want to squash consumer spending either, because that's keeping the economy going to some extent, isn't it? Everything that comes from consumer spending, VAT and more money circulating in the economy and everything keeps the economy going while it gets back on its feet after the pandemic, I think. So that's that one. On the last one, on capital spend, as you know, capital spend is always an issue for us, that we set a budget and then we rarely achieve it for various issues. COVID made matters considerably worse during 2021 because we didn't spend anything for 4 months because we couldn't get on a site to do anything. Should we borrow now and accelerate our capital programme? Yes, would be the answer if we had the capacity and the schemes to deliver everything. But if you rush into schemes now, they may not be the best schemes. That they may not meet the priorities of the council. And if you saddle the council with debt, even though it's got low interest rates attached to it, it restricts future borrowing when you might have a different set of schemes that you want to spend on and meet your priority. It's like having money in your pocket and you go out and spend it and then you go, oh, I haven't got any money left now. Oh, I wish I'd have kept some and saved it and spent it on this. So it's always a matter of getting priorities, isn't it? What actually is good spend for the council rather than just any spend, if that answers your question.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions? I don't know. Would Robin like to contribute, or is quite happy with that?
No, it's a very technical report, as you know, Mr. Chairman, and I think that Mark is the best person to present that. So I'm happy to leave it at that for today. Thank you.
Tremendous. Thank you very much indeed. So with that, then I think that we draw that item to a close. I need now. I think the recommendations are that the committee has recommended that the outturn figures in this report will remain provisional until the audit of 2020-21 statement of accounts is completed and signed off. Any resulting significant adjustments to the figures included in this report will be reported as appropriate. 2, note the provisional 2020-21 Prudential and Treasury indicators in this report. And 3, consider the annual Treasury Management Report for 2020-21 and pass it on to the next meeting of the Executive with any comments. I need a proposer now for those recommendations. I'm going to take the first. I think, nobody, anybody, can anybody support the proposal? Yeah, thank you, John. And a seconder, and I've got Jeff. Thank you very much indeed. So I've got John Griffiths and Jeff. So I'll go around the committee now to seek their approval. Dylan Rees.
Derbyn, accept.
Alan Roberts.
Derbyn.
Margaret.
Derbyn.
Accept.
Gwilym.
Yes. Derbyn.
Accept.
And of course, Dilwyn.
Accept. Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you for that, Mark. We then move on to item 5. Quite an interesting one is the annual Counterfraud, Bribery and Corruption Report 2020-2021. I think it's over Marion to deliver this. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Members will be aware that they won't have seen a report of this type before. It's the first time that I have brought this report to you, and it's the first of a programme of counter-fraud work that we'll be starting this year. We were hoping to start last year, but with the COVID emergency, we weren't able to work on our counter-fraud strategy. So normally you would get a strategy first and then an annual report to report on the delivery of the strategy. So this is our first step on our journey to our counter-fraud work. It starts by just reminding those around the table what fraud actually is, and it's an all-encompassing definition. So those of us, and I know there are a few around the table who have much more intimate knowledge of criminal law than I do, but this new Fraud Act in 2006 has been brought out to bring an actual definition of fraud, whereas before it used to fall under a number of areas, including the Theft Act 1968. We use a very simple definition. It involves stealing, and it's by some means of deception or misrepresentation. So you can see there on that diagram on page 4 what we actually consider fraud to be. So that's where it considers the bribery and corruption side of it as well. I move on to talk about why countering fraud is important. There's been a really big move recently by the government, the Welsh government in particular, to look at what the Welsh public sector is doing in terms of its counter-fraud work. It commissioned the Wales Audit Office, as it was Audit Wales now, to do some work on the countering fraud in the public sector, and a couple of reports were written by the Auditor General for Wales on that. And you'll see that on the next page, that in the current contexts, what the Wales-wide arrangements of counter-fraud are. And you can see that it varies widely across the public sector. The NHS Wales invests very heavily in national local counter-fraud activity. The Welsh Government itself prioritises investigation rather than prevention. And then across local government in Wales, following the transfer of the counter-fraud officers to the DWP back in 2014, the dedicated counter-fraud personnel have transferred over to the DWP. So I think there's only one council in Wales now that has actually continued to have a counter-fraud team. I think that's Swansea County Council. So there's no overarching group or professional network that supports us in our counter-fraud work. So what we've done in North Wales, we've got together, North and Mid Wales, sorry, there's 7 authorities in North and Mid Wales, is we've got together and we've brought together the professionals to have a counter-fraud subgroup. And we've had 2 meetings now, and we're currently establishing the baseline. So where we all are at, what the Auditor General considers at what position we should be at, and we're developing an action plan to all move together as one big 7 authorities to move together to improve our counter-fraud work. So the CIPFA counter-fraud and corruption tracker reports annually, and on page 7 there it talks about what it considers to be the frauds in local government. and the emerging areas of fraud. It reports that the largest growing fraud area in the UK is housing tenancy fraud, with an estimated 60 million lost in 2019-20 compared to 47 million in 2018-19. We've spoken to the head of housing services to discuss what kind of counter fraud work is done in this area. He doesn't consider that it is a high risk. It's a fairly low risk in Anglesey, but he has issued an awareness raising article in a recent newsletter, and his services housing management officers have been on some tenancy fraud training. The other area, the next largest growing area of fraud in the UK, is single person discount, where a person gets 25% off their council tax for if they live on their own. And this has an estimated 9.6 million, an increase of 9.6 million to an estimated value of 29 million for cases in 2018. We use an external company to review our single person discount claims and to detect any errors or fraud that have occurred. There is an exercise currently underway. I've only been able to give you the figures from August 2018 because the outcome of the latest exercise isn't available yet, but the last exercise in August 2018 identified £340,000 worth of errors with an error rate of 4.3%. They did consider this to be slightly high, but that's because it hadn't been done for a while. So hopefully, because it's been done quite soon after this in 2020, then 2021, early 2021, then this figure hopefully shall have come down. The other area that is perceived by CIPFA to be a high risk area is procurement fraud. And this is somewhere where the council has acknowledged that it's not particularly strong on where officers authorise, manager and monitor contracts with the private sector. So we'll be conducting a piece of work during 21-22 to review the vulnerability of the council to procurement fraud. Moving on across the page, there is a CIPFA code managing the risk of fraud, and it has 5 areas where it considers a council should benchmark itself against, and these are discussed in each of the areas here. The first being acknowledging responsibility. The senior leadership team have done this. They've acknowledged their responsibility, and they do have on the corporate risk register YM46 risk of fraud against the council, and we have a number of mitigating controls in place and an action plan to consider that and track our progress with addressing that risk. The second principle is around fraud risk identification, and although we have a mature risk management process, and the risk and insurance manager discusses fraud risk with the services when she visits to consider their service risk registers, we haven't specifically got a fraud risk register. So this is something I'll be working on during 21-22 with services to bring us all together as a counter fraud working group to consider specifically counter fraud risks. The third principle advocates counter fraud and corruption strategy as an important area. Although we've got a policy, a number of policies around this area, we don't have one overarching strategy to pull this all together. So that will be one of my priorities this year, and I'll be bringing that to you at your December 2021 meeting. The next principle advocates resources. This principle deals with the capacity of the council to deal. As I mentioned, we don't have our own counter fraud professionals or a dedicated resource for counter fraud, but what we do have is a new post within the team that has an element of their work to do with the National Fraud Initiative, where we'll be looking at the matches undertaken during the National Fraud Initiative exercise to identify or potential areas of fraud. So we'll be reporting to you on that on a regular basis. The final principle is take action, and this is where it wants where we discover fraud, SIPFA endorses that we should be investigating fraud and publicising fraud, and raising awareness of staff. So in the two tables there, you've got two of the policies that are related to fraud and the acknowledgement of staff that they have understood and read those policies. Up-to-date figures will be given to you in September when the monitoring officer brings her report to you with an updated figure. You can see there on page 11 that we've undertaken a number of fraud-raising events during the year, where staff have done some virtual training, some face-to-face but on a virtual basis, and some with the NatWest Bank, our bankers, to give us fraud awareness and scamming awareness training. We also plan to do an e-learning for staff so they can access that at a time it's convenient to them. The Chief Exec has also issued a general email to staff in April 2020 to remind them of their obligations around cybercrime. We regularly share National Anti-Fraud Network alerts with the relevant staff, and all fraud occurrences are reported to the Governance and Audit Committee and to the senior leadership team. So you'll be aware of two fraud occurrences that happened last year. I reported these I reported these to you last year. They were mandate frauds or malicious redirection frauds. I won't go over them again because we did talk in some detail about them when they occurred. Suffice to say that although the victim of one, we got the majority of the money back, and in the second one, it was averted completely due to the fraud risk awareness training that we'd had the previous week. So very timely training. Also during the year, the grants team has detected and stopped a number of attempted fraudulent COVID-19 grant fraud applications before payment. We don't currently have a system for services to report fraud to internal audit. It is written in the financial procedure rules that services should report them to us. So hopefully with the Counterfraud working group set up, it will reinforce this message that all frauds should be reported to internal audit, so it makes sure we are able to report them to you. So in conclusion, some level of public sector fraud is likely. It is going to happen, even in normal times, but 2021 was an unusual year with unprecedented challenges. And the first malicious redirection fraud was wholly, I think, the subject or the fraudster taking advantage of the fact that it was the first week of lockdown and everybody had been sent home. And the country was a little chaotic, to say the least. We have done some counter-fraud work during 2021, in particular when one of our members of staff was redeployed to the business grants team, and they worked closely with Mark to ensure that we stopped any fraudulent payments for the applications for the COVID-19 business grants frauds. And so the challenges and opportunities for us going forwards, I think every single council in Wales is struggling with capacity for counter-fraud professionals, and the Welsh Government, and in particular the Auditor General for Wales, is very keen that we do work together and collaborate to improve our counter-fraud work. So that's what we've been doing with this counter-fraud subgroup in North and Mid Wales. We have acknowledged that we need to do more to raise awareness of counter-fraud. So we'll be doing the e-learning package and refreshing the policies. But there's also a clear need for a tough stance by elected members, chief exec, and those charged with governance to make sure that we have these robust arrangements in place to make sure that if we do or alerted to any fraud, we do investigate and we do prosecute anybody that we found to be guilty of fraud. not that they're guilty of fraud, but to prosecute them and take them to court. But it is the behaviours and actions of all members of staff that will generate a culture that is a counter-fraud culture that will make sure that fraud is minimised in the organisation. So we're just setting out on the journey. This is our first steps into working on counter-fraud initiatives. But hopefully, as I say, in December 2021, I'll be bringing the strategy to you. And this time next year, I'll be reporting how well we've done with our initiatives this year. Happy to take any questions, Chair.
Thank you very much. I think one of the most interesting things was the formation of the subcommittee of 7 other authorities working together, because a lot of these frauds will have similarities. And I'm sure that, that will be a tremendous benefit. I'm looking now for Art. I think I've got one hand. I've got Jeff Evans, Councillor Jeff Evans.
Yes, thank you for letting me in. I want to refer to page 50, current and emerging fraud risks, in relation to the largest growing fraud area in the UK. It relates to housing tenancy, with an estimated £60.1 million loss. I want to refer to that because historically I have been involved in issues as to what I believe is a serious fraud, where the local authority issues monies to tenants to pay landlords with no intent whatsoever to pay it. The result being that thousands of pounds are taken away from the authority, and thousands of pounds are not then issued to the landlord, resulting in ongoing issues. They eventually lose their property, they come back to the authority, they then are looking for a new household, etc., etc. And I brought this up to the council some time ago, and I asked them if they knew that a fraud was occurring. And by a fraud occurring is exactly what I just said, that they received claiming money, receiving it, not paying it. Would the council continue to pay that tenant ongoing, even in another tenancy? And the answer I had was yes, because legislation demands that. It's a major fraud. I know of so many people, and I get so many complaints from landlords that because they are not paid the rent direct, and it goes to the tenant, it is only the tenant who gains, and both the authority and the landlord who suffers major fraud and loss. I don't know what can be done with that, because it is a national problem. It is a legislative demand that you pay the tenant direct. But it's costing us millions. It's causing us problems with housing. It's causing us problems for landlords. It's causing us problems all over the place. And if this says 60.1 million is lost, I tend to think there'll be double that figure. But what can be done? And is this the right place to bring it up?
I see Mark has got his hand up. Did you want to go before Marion answered that, or is that?
I think it would be probably more appropriate for me to respond to that one as the officer that's responsible for payment of housing benefits.
Thank you.
Housing benefits, of course, is a claim from the tenant, and the council processes the claim and issues money to the tenant in respect of their claim. It is not for the council to decide or to ensure that the tenant then uses that money to clear any contractual obligations they have with their landlord. The legislation is clear. It is the tenant's right to have the payment of their benefits paid to them. It is a benefit, not the council paying rent on their behalf. We pay benefits to the claimant, and the claimant is then responsible for passing it on. If the claim is fraudulent, i.e. the tenant has no entitlement, or the claimant has no entitlement to benefit, as Marion explained, we are no longer responsible for the investigation of benefit fraud. We simply pass our evidence on to the DWP, who have their own fraud team who investigate benefit fraud. So we no longer do benefit fraud as a duty on us. So in response to Councillor Evans's questions, one, we can't do a lot because we are obliged to pay the tenant or the claimant their claim if it is a genuine claim. If the claim is fraudulent, well, it's not our responsibility or duty to investigate that any fraudulent activity by the claimant.
Whilst I do understand that, Mark, and I'm not relating to a fraudulent claim in that they're not making a genuine claim, I'm saying it's fraudulent in that they have no intention of passing those monies claimed onto the rightful person to whom it's intended. And the fact is, at the end of the day, it is the council who loses that money, and it is the landlord who loses the money, and it is the fraudulent claimant. And you see it on TV shows all the time, millions of pounds, which is being not paid to the rightful person as intended. And originally, councils and were paying landlords direct. So this is a new phenomenon, but it is one which is causing a lot of people a lot of distress. Maybe you're right, and I accept you can't do much about it, but it is a fraud which is going on, which is costing a lot of people a tremendous amount of hardship and difficulty.
Just to clarify one point, we make payments to the claimant. It is their entitlement to the benefit. Yeah. We are not paying something they're not entitled to. We are paying them their entitlement from their claim. Whether they pay that over to the landlord is another issue and is a contractual issue between the tenant and the landlord, and it's not the duty of the council to ensure that benefit payments are then used for the purposes intended. That's unfortunately the way it stands.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that response. I've got one more hand up. I think it's Dilwyn.
I just want to ask Marion why, when listing on page 7 or page 50, the current and emerging fraud risks, that cyber fraud is not mentioned there. I know it's mentioned later on in the report, but it surely is of impact on local authorities as much as it is on individuals.
That's an interesting point, actually. Is it fraud in terms of yes, it's a threat. These are actually it's the SIP for Counterfraud and Corruption Tracker that these figures have all come from. It is a risk, but would they consider cyber as a fraud risk in particular? It's only when, I suppose, a ransomware attack or a DOS attack is undertaken where they attempt to get monies from us. But even then, if you go back to the definition of what fraud is under the Fraud Act, I'm not sure whether the cyber would be fraud in that way, in the way that this report's talking about fraud.
I think that's quite a fine point.
Yeah. But no, it wasn't the Counterfraud, the Counterfraud and Corruption Tracker doesn't mention it in terms of cyber. Cyber more tends to be spoken about as cyber crime rather than fraud. So it is no, it's not a crime in its own right, but I suppose it's the ransomware. Would that be considered fraud? I don't know. Maybe the ex-police officers on the call could tell you what the difference in that definition is. I did, before we move on, Chair, I did want to just clarify one thing though in those figures, in that third sentence where the third paragraph where it does talk about 60 million lost in tenancy fraud. It's not tenancy fraud in terms of the financial terms of the housing rent, the housing benefit paid for the rent. It's in terms of subletting and those types of fraud. where there's a huge problem in London and the more populated areas where people are subletting their council houses and council flats. So they get a tenancy, which they don't really need. They move in with a friend and then sublet their council house or council flat and get the money. That's what that 60 million is. It's not to do with the housing benefit.
Thank you very much. You can relax, John, because I think Dylan has rushed in to ask this question. Dylan. I'm sure.
Yeah. Thank you, Chairman. No, when John and I were sort of in the police service, cybercrime was not an issue. So we certainly aren't experts in that area, I don't think. I've also got a question in relation to the current and emerging fraud risks in relation to page 7 of the report. And we do see in the local media from time to time publicity of enforcement cases to deter people in relation to council tax fraud and also housing fraud. But I don't recall seeing publicity in relation to enforcement cases of disabled parking concession fraud, blue badge schemes. Now, is it because we're not detecting them? Is it because it's not happening? Or is it because we're not publicising that here on Anglesey?
Again, I don't think it's a particular problem for Anglesey. The blue badge fraud they're speaking about in this context is where in London, because they have the parking is such a problem and it costs a lot of money. People are fraudulently applying for a blue badge or selling a blue badge so that people can park for free. I think selling of blue badges on Anglesey is I think is virtually non-existent. I really don't think the only thing I suppose you could have a blue badge being issued on Anglesey and then sold, and somebody in London could be using it, I suppose. But it's London boroughs and the inner city areas where there's a lot of car parks, council-owned car parks, that are missing out on income because of blue badge fraud. Yeah. The National Fraud Initiative has put a value of £575 associated with each blue badge that is fraudulently used or sold. With all the best will in the world, if somebody sold a blue badge on Anglesey and it was used on Anglesey, we are not going to be losing £575 worth of car parking income. So I really don't think it's an issue on Anglesey.
Yeah.
I've got one more hand up, but I'm not sure that's been left there by Mark. It's probably been.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I thought I'd taken it down, but I haven't. Obviously.
No, it's all right. It's all right. I think that comes. I don't think I've got any other hands up at all. I don't think.
Chair, you've got Councillor John Griffiths.
Oh, so I'm very sorry. I wouldn't want to miss John. John?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
It's hard to believe, in my opinion, that £7.3 billion is lost by local government, and that over £1 billion is lost in Wales. What percentage of that £1 billion has been lost on Anglesey? That's a very difficult question to answer. If you talk to Mark, he'd say not a lot at all. He doesn't think that fraud risk is high at all on Anglesey. I think that's places like Cardiff and in South Wales. That's where the majority of the fraud takes place. Mark was telling me when I started working for the council, everybody knows each other. There's no fraud going on the island. But if it does happen, we know about it. Thank you. I had a number of questions to ask, but thank you, Marion. You've answered the majority of them. One thing I noticed in the report, and I'm quite surprised, and that is that there isn't a system for services to inform about possible fraud that have been identified and prevented. As a former police officer, please remember that any attempts to steal or to defraud are crimes. In my opinion, publicity about these sorts of prosecutions would help to stop these cases rather than just ignoring them. So I support the intention to strengthen the counter-fraud strategy. I do think you should consider appointing or creating a special or designated counter-fraud role, not just to stop fraud, but to gather all the evidence to take prosecutions to court. I don't believe in these soft touch approaches. You know, if somebody tries to steal money or to defraud the council, they should be prosecuted. And we should be publicising that to stop fraud in the future. Thank you, Marion.
Yeah.
Could I just add to Marion's comments, please, Mr. Chairman?
Of course you can.
Yeah, just the egluro.
Yes, just to explain more about what Marion said. I don't want you to leave this afternoon thinking that fraud is impossible in Anglesey Council. Any person that has the means, the skills, you can at least try to defraud the council. It's up to the council to stop people from defrauding it. You know, I'm not saying that it is impossible and that it doesn't happen. My conclusion, after 30 years of working in this area and having worked in internal audit, if I go back to when I started working in internal audit, you know, how much cash was collected, how many examples I came across and reported on of, for example, dinner money clerks in schools stealing money. You know, that risk has disappeared because we're cashless in schools now. We don't accept cash in schools. So those risks have reduced significantly. Benefits fraud, of course, I said we're not responsible for investigating benefits fraud anymore. But the amount of data that is checked against information held by the council and DWP and HMRC and so on, you know, there's a lot more data checking that goes on now. We make much more use of computers to do these checks than we did 20 years ago. So the possibility of someone not doing their job and missing something, you know, by mistake rather than on purpose, those checks have reduced because the computers now undertake a lot of those checks. Yes, we do know each other. It's helpful to be in a small authority at times. You know, if something out of the ordinary does go through, there's a good chance that somebody will flag it up. But in a large council where you have a lot more bills and things going through the financial systems, well, there's less hope for an individual to say, hang on, what's this? A good example is the business grants that we paid out. We paid out £40 million over the last year, but I'd say that someone has checked all of those claims, and I am quite confident that we got 99% of them correct. I'm aware of one case where we think that fraud has happened, but apart from that, I'm quite confident that we did pay the right sum to the right person and that they received what they deserved. But that was because of how we went about it and because we assessed those grant applications. So I don't completely agree with Marian's summary of the discussion we had. I'm not saying that there isn't any fraud on Anglesey, but in a small council and the way we operate, you know, the risk is much smaller. And these people who do this for a living, if you want to put it like that, they tend to target much larger councils than Anglesey because, you know, their potential gain is much higher by targeting bigger councils in London, Cardiff, Birmingham, Glasgow. You must remember that Birmingham Council's expenditure is bigger than the expenditure of the 22 councils in Wales together. You know, by targeting one large council, the return is much bigger than trying to target a small council in Wales. So that's where I come from. So I'm not saying that there isn't any fraud or any possibility of fraud taking place in Anglesey. It is possible. It might have happened, but not on a big scale. If something has gone through, it'll be small sums of money, I'd imagine. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mark.
I've got another hand. I think I've got Robin. Have I? Robin's hand is up.
Yeah, diolch, Mr. Cadeirydd.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Just one comment as someone who has over 30 years experience working in the financial sector. Obviously, fraud is something that has been drummed into us over many years. And I think the message here is that we raise awareness among staff in the council of the types of fraud that they could come across during or as part of their work, and that they know where to turn so that they can report any doubts they have about any sort of fraud that they might encounter. As Mark said, the world has changed and the types of fraud have certainly changed, you know, compared to when I started working behind the counter in NatWest in Menai Bridge many years ago. At that time, fraud would take place because there was so much cash circulating. You know, things are much more sophisticated now, and certainly in terms of the types of fraud. But the important thing is that we raise awareness and that we maintain awareness amongst our staff so that they can identify these cases when they come across them. During my career, at least once a year, we had to take specific training on fraud and other elements. I think that's something we should be encouraging our staff to do so that they are aware of the dangers that exist. And perhaps the scale might not be big, but it's bound to be happening on Anglesey just like it is in other areas. It might not be on such a large scale, but it's bound to be happening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've got Dilwyn. I
just want to ask, Chairman, whether we should ask our external auditors to get a little bit more involved in fraud detection. I think at the moment they'll report fraud if they come across it. They never look for it intentionally. And I fear that we may be in the situation that things are going on that we have no knowledge of and therefore can be complacent. I know this is like shutting the stable door after the horse is bolted, but at least we'd get a better measure of how much fraud is occurring in the council if external audit would pay a bit more attention to it. Thank you.
Who's, is Marion going to, do you have any views on that, Marion?
External audit, Alan Hughes is here on the call.
Oh.
I think he probably wants to answer
terrific.
rather than me.
Yeah, terrific.
Hi, thanks. Just to respond to Dylan's question, we can always look at the scope of our work when planning the work with the corporate management team at the start of the year. We can share examples of fraud that we have come across during the year and so on. But ultimately, detecting fraud is something that the internal controls of the council should be primarily be doing for you. So it's about getting assurances that those internal controls are in place, that training is up to date, that there is good fraud awareness in the council. I would suggest that those are the primary controls that you need to hone first of all.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, I think we're very lucky to have you there, sitting in the back, listening to that question, to take it. I think that brings us to an end of item 5, and the recommendation is that the committee considers and comments on the activity carried out during 2020-21 to minimise the risk of fraud, bribery and corruption occurring within and against the council. Can I have a proposer of that, please? Yeah, thank you. Gwilym is proposing, and I need a seconder.
Second chair, Dylan Rees.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So I'll go around the committee. John Griffiths.
Derbyn, accept.
Alan Roberts.
Derbyn.
Accept.
Margaret Roberts.
Derbyn. Accept.
Jeff Evans.
Accept.
And Dilwyn Evans.
Accept.
That brings the conclusion of item 5, and now we move on to item 6. And I think again the author is Marion. Is Marion leading on this?
Yes, I am, Chair.
Well done.
So this is your usual update report on the work that we've done in just a little under 3 months since we last reported to you back in April. You'll see that first table under paragraph 3 is the work we've completed. The first 4 audits, you've had the reports for those, and you had them at last times. I think it was the June audit committee. You would have had them. We didn't discuss them in any detail. I don't, but you needed them for to support the annual report, so you've had them already. Then the final 3 were included in your pack, so the full report and the action plan for the final one, which is the management of school and official funds. I don't really want to talk about these in any detail because, as you can see from that table, in those 3 reports, we've only actually raised 1 risk issue. So very pleased with the work that's been gone there. Of particular mention is the work that was undertaken by the education department. The staff there have been really engaged in the audit we did last year. And when we followed up, I think there's only 1 moderate risk outstanding. All the others have been implemented. And this is a piece of work we did, and we helped the education department with the unofficial funds in schools. So this is the funds that schools hold where they've raised cash, raised funds for the extracurricular activities that they undertake and things that the school budget doesn't actually cover. So I think we have now, you'll see from your report that all the audit certificates have now been produced. There's just 1 where our external audit person is working on. But so you have assurance that every single school in Anglesey, bar that one that's in progress, has an audit certificate for this school fund. So a really fabulous piece of work, and I really would like to congratulate the education department staff, Aaron Evans and his team, for really grasping hold of this and making sure that everything was addressed in the action plan. You'll see from the table below that there are 3 pieces of work in progress. They're just coming up to draft report stage now, so they'll be with you next time. There are a number of overdue actions, but these are also being followed up at the moment as well. So I'm hoping that by the next meeting in September, we'll have concluded our work there, and I'll be able to give you some good news on their successful implementation. And we've also been involved in 3 investigations, 2 of which are still ongoing and 1 has recently been concluded. And then at Appendix 1, you can see the dashboard there, very brief dashboard of the items that are outstanding. As I said, there's 2 major and 6 moderate, and they're to do with the levers process report we did last year and the supplier maintenance report we did in January 2021.
Thank you very much. I think it was particularly good, the praise that you were giving to the education of the management of the school and official funds. That was, they made as you quite rightly said, they made amazing progress. Do we have any questions? I'm looking for hands. No, I think that if well done.
Sorry, Councillor John Griffiths.
Oh, sorry, I've got Dilwyn as well. Just a minute, we've got a terrific rush. Yeah, John Griffiths.
I'm sorry, I don't want to sound pedantic in any way, but it's something that's puzzled me every time I see this dashboard. You've got 1 column called overdue actions. You've got another column called outstanding actions. What's the difference between the 2?
So overdue, I'm glad you've asked that question. I can explain what it is. The overdue actions are actions that have missed their target due date. So there are 8 actions there that the management said they would have done by a certain date, and that would have been now. The total outstanding actions is every single action that is outstanding, but the target date hasn't been reached yet. So they're still working on it, and they've said, for example, they'll have it implemented by December next year and the like. So we're not too body then. That's the total entirety of what's outstanding. So I think what is it, 41? So there's 60, and of those 60, there's 8 that are overdue.
Not bad. Well done.
Yeah.
Now it's over to Dilwyn.
Thank you, Chair. I just want to ask Marion about the significant figure of 35 in the outstanding issues on resources. It sticks out like a sore thumb. And what's happening with resources at the moment?
Well, I think it's skewed slightly because we have done a lot of audits in resources. As a result of the fraud that we had, we did do 2 audits in creditors. One was the supplier maintenance, and one was the identification of duplicate payments and the recovery of those. They're still all, these aren't overdue. So there's 7 of those are overdue, but the others are work in progress and haven't come to their due date yet. But yes, to be fair to resources, the majority of our work has recently been in resources, and so it does look as if it's skewed slightly.
Thank you.
I don't think there's anybody else that wants to. No, I think that concludes that. Can we? I think the recommendation is that the Governance and Audit Committee notes the internal audit assurance provision and priorities going forward. I need a proposer, I need a seconder. No, oh, just a minute, I've got John. John Griffiths is proposing.
Second.
And yep, and Alan is seconding. So I'll go around the table now. Dylan Rees.
Derbyn, accept.
Margaret Roberts.
Derbyn.
Accept.
Gwilym.
Accept.
Jeff.
Accept.
And Dilwyn.
Accept.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we now move on, and I should have welcomed Mr. Ellen Hughes before. I now see him in the team now. I hadn't actually seen you before. Welcome, and I think you're going to deal with the next thing, which is the Audit Wales, the works programme and timetable for Anglesey County Council. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Diolch, Mr. Cadeirydd. I ddechrau fo, beth o'n i licio neud...
First of all, what I'd like to do is to introduce you to a summary of the reports we have in a new format, which tells you what the status of the work that is ongoing by Audit Wales in the Council currently. And it also gives you a summary of the work of other regulators, and gives an overview, a summary of national work as well, and also the reports that we have published up to now. So as we become familiar with this report format, I hope it will be a one-stop shop for you of the work that we are doing locally and the work that we have completed, and it will also give you a picture at a national level and the flavour of the work undertaken by other regulators. We intend to issue this quarterly, and we could arrange it so that it coincides with the meeting dates of audit committees across Wales. But then if you consider that we have to create the report for 22 authorities that meet at different times, well, we'd be just updating the report all the time. So what we're going to do is to issue it quarterly and then put it on the agenda of the next audit meeting. So I'll just go quickly through the summary. First of all, you can see financial audit work. The work of auditing the council's accounts is underway. We also certify housing benefits subsidy claims. Work is being done on last year and the previous year. Performance audit work, then we have 3 local reports here and 1 regional report, and 2 focusing specifically on Anglesey, and these 3 reports are more or less in draft format. 1 has more or less been agreed, another one is being corrected, and I hope that these 3 reports commissioning older people's care home placements, financial sustainability and workforce planning should be on the agenda of the Governance and Audit Committee very soon. Then the next table outlines the work that we'll be undertaking during the coming year. And then if we move on through the report, I'll just give you a flavour of the national reports that are ongoing and have been completing, and then touching on the work of other regulators. And in the back, there's a list of reports that have already been published. They're the national reports. I hope that the summary will be beneficial for you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. Does anybody? I don't think there are. I think it's a pretty straightforward report what you've done, and I'd like to to thank you. So I think that we're going to. I haven't missed it. No, it's a case now of accepting this now, and I need to. I've got a proposer. I've got Dilwyn is proposing, and Jeff is seconding. Thank you very much. Can I go around the table then? John Griffiths.
Derbyn, accept.
Dylan Rees.
Derbyn, accept.
Alan Roberts.
Derbyn, accept.
Margaret Roberts.
Derbyn, accept.
Gwilym Jones.
Derbyn,
Accept.
And that's it. So we accept that report. Yeah. So thank you very much indeed for use. Thank you very much. I think we'll move on now to the final item. I think that is correct. Is the final item is the update on the work forward program, and I think that that there are some minor amendments that put onto the approved program for 2021-22. Are there any? When you look at that report, I don't know whether does Marion want to say anything?
Yes, Chair, just members will recall that you approved your forward work programme for 2021-22 at the last meeting, or the May meeting. There have been a couple of minor amendments where either workload issues or things to do with the legislation have changed, or there's an additional one. So members, you'll see the 8th of February, there's an additional report coming to you there, and that's the annual report of the Partnerships and Regeneration Scrutiny Committee. The local code of governance has moved as well. That should have been coming to this meeting, but they decided that it would be better going to the December meeting. September was too full with all the annual assurance reports that you've got going there, so we've pushed that back to the December meeting. The fraud strategy has been pushed back to the December meeting so that the Counterfraud working group can do some work on it first. And finally, on the last line, the panel performance draft self-assessment won't now be coming to you this year. It'll be coming to you next year. And that's it, Chair. They're the only amendments from the report that you had back in May that the committee approved.
Thank you very much. I think Dilwyn is going to ask a question. Dilwyn.
I'd like to see the item fraud strategy be changed to counter fraud.
Yep, no problem. I can do that.
I think that's what's intended, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yes. It's not committing fraud, it's countering fraud. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you very much.
I don't think there's anything. I think it's just a case of now accepting the forward work program. Don't know. So again, I need the recommendation is that we've accepted the Governance and Audit Committee notes the minor amendments to the approved forward work program for 2021 to 2022. And I've got Gwilym to propose it, and I want to second it. I've got and Jeff Evans. So I need to go around quickly again to get the approval of all the committee. Start with John Griffiths.
Yeah, diolch I Marian.
Yes, with thanks to Marian and everybody who contributed. I accept.
Well done. Dylan?
Derbyn, accept.
Alan Roberts?
Accept.
Margaret Roberts?
Yes, I echo John's thanks and I accept.
And Dilwyn?
Accept. Thank you.
So I think that brings the meeting to an end. I just thank you all for your attendance and particularly for your contributions, particularly for all the officers who have taken part, and special thanks again, I think, to Anne Holmes, our hardworking committee clerk. Thank you very much indeed. So we've now called the meeting to an end. Thank you.
Diolch yn fawr, hwyl fawr.